Imagine a world where the European and Pacific theaters of World War II were split, where America faced only Japan, and Germany had a chance to consolidate its power in Europe. The war still rages, but the timeline and the stakes look very different. In this scenario, every decision, every battle, every alliance takes on a new, unpredictable weight. A world upside down. The First World War ended in 1918, leaving Europe in ruins and society deeply scarred. Entire cities had been destroyed, economies shattered, and millions of soldiers and civilians dead or maimed. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, faced staggering reparations, the loss of territory, and severe restrictions on its military, creating widespread resentment among its people. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s wiped out savings, plunging families into poverty and despair. Extremist political movements, from communists to far-right paramilitary groups, surged, capitalizing on the nation's anger, fear, and desperation. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from the war as an economic powerhouse, its factories booming and industries modernizing at an unprecedented pace. Yet the trauma of the war and the distance of the Atlantic fueled isolationist sentiment. Americans turned inward, focusing on domestic prosperity rather than foreign entanglements. Across Europe, Italy, led by Mussolini, sought to restore national pride and assert influence through fascist policies, invading Ethiopia and consolidating power at home. Japan, too, began its imperial expansion in Asia, seeking resources and territory to fuel its growing military and industrial ambitions. The global balance was precarious. Europe was fractured, economies unstable, and extremist ideologies spreading rapidly. In this tense and volatile world, a critical question emerges. What if Germany, calculating the risks, avoided provoking the United States? Could it have consolidated power in Europe and Asia unchecked, reshaping the geopolitical landscape before any intervention from across the Atlantic? The implications were enormous, setting the stage for a world teetering on the edge of another devastating conflict, yet with a twist that could change history entirely. America looks inward. The 1920s in the United States were defined by a retreat from global affairs. After the devastation of the First World War, the American public was deeply wary of entanglement in overseas conflicts. Presidents Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge embodied this sentiment, emphasizing domestic prosperity over foreign ambitions. Their policies focused on economic growth, reducing government intervention in business, and maintaining high tariffs to protect American industries. The country's factories boomed, consumer culture flourished, and the stock market soared, creating a sense of optimism and stability that contrasted sharply with the turmoil across Europe. Despite mounting instability abroad, Americans largely ignored the threats posed by rising fascist regimes in Europe and militaristic expansion in Asia. Isolationism became a central pillar of U.S. politics, influencing legislation, trade policies, and military planning. Congress passed neutrality acts to prevent the nation from being drawn into conflicts that did not directly threaten American soil. Public opinion strongly supported these measures, with newspapers, civic organizations, and political leaders warning against repeating the perceived mistakes of World War I. The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 marked a turning point domestically, but not yet internationally. Roosevelt's New Deal sought to stabilize the American economy after the Great Depression, providing relief to millions through job programs, social security, and financial reforms. While the New Deal dramatically reshaped the domestic landscape, Roosevelt's foreign policy remained cautious. Military spending increased slowly, primarily to strengthen the defense of U.S. territories rather than to project power abroad. During this period, the United States carefully monitored global events but avoided direct intervention. Diplomatic engagement focused on trade agreements, sanctions, and negotiations rather than military action. Even as fascism rose in Italy, Germany, and Japan, America's eyes were largely fixed on domestic recovery, preparing its population and economy to withstand any eventual threats, but not yet committing to the battles that would soon engulf the world. Germany rises. The Great Depression struck Germany with devastating force, worsening the already fragile Weimar Republic. Hyperinflation, skyrocketing unemployment, and widespread poverty fueled anger and disillusionment among the population. Political unrest escalated, with street clashes between communists, nationalists, and paramilitary groups. In this climate of fear and instability, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to prominence, promising order, national pride, and revenge for the perceived injustices of the Versailles Treaty. By 1933, Hitler had become Chancellor, and the Nazis quickly moved to dismantle democratic institutions, consolidating power under a totalitarian regime that would reshape Germany and Europe. Hitler immediately began a campaign of rearmament, violating the restrictions imposed by Versailles. Factories were rebuilt, the military expanded, and new economic policies aimed at self-sufficiency took shape. European powers, particularly Britain and France, grew increasingly anxious, watching Germany's moves in the Rhineland and Austria. Even Mussolini, who initially saw Germany as a potential ally, began to reconsider his position as Hitler's ambitions became clear. The continent braced for conflict, though no one could predict the scale it would reach. Despite the looming threat in Europe, the United States remained largely detached. American businesses continued investing in Germany, and events like the 1936 Olympics created a misleading sense of normalcy and cultural exchange. Isolationist sentiment dominated public opinion, and while Roosevelt monitored developments and prepared the nation defensively, there was no appetite for direct intervention. Germany was free to strengthen its power, while the US focused on domestic recovery, waiting for circumstances that might eventually pull it into the coming storm. Axis dynamics. By the late 1930s, Germany, Italy, and Japan were increasingly coordinated, forming the foundation of what would become known as the Axis powers. Hitler's aggressive ambitions reshaped Central Europe, starting with the annexation of Austria in 1938 and followed by the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Each move tested the resolve of Britain and France, who were reluctant to confront Germany militarily. Meanwhile, Mussolini sought to assert Italian dominance in Africa and the Balkans, but his campaigns often faltered due to poor planning and logistical shortcomings, undermining Italy's position on the international stage. Japan, observing Europe from afar, sought to expand its influence in East Asia, targeting China and resource-rich territories, but faced fierce resistance and supply challenges. Despite these struggles, the Axis powers found common ground in their opposition to Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Diplomatic and military coordination improved as the three nations formalized their alliance through agreements and shared strategic goals. However, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Italy's failures in Africa and Greece frustrated Hitler, while Japan's growing demands for resources and influence in Asia created friction with both Germany and Italy. The Axis was a partnership of convenience, bound more by shared enemies than by mutual trust or consistent strategy. In this alternate timeline, the dynamics shifted further, due to Germany's cautious approach toward the United States. By avoiding any declaration of war on America, Hitler ensured that U.S. attention remained focused on Japan's expansion in Asia. Economic sanctions and trade restrictions strained relations with the Axis, but without confrontation, Germany could continue its European ambitions unimpeded. Meanwhile, American leaders monitored the situation, enforcing sanctions and building defenses, but they were not yet drawn into European conflicts. The Axis powers thus grew stronger, yet cracks in their alliance foreshadowed the complexities that would shape the coming global struggle. The Pacific War begins. December 7th, 1941, brought a day that would live in infamy. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the United States, destroying battleships, crippling airfields, and claiming thousands of lives. Public opinion shifted overnight, and the American government declared war on Japan without hesitation. This event ignited the full-scale mobilization of the nation's industrial and military capacity. Shipyards worked around the clock. Aircraft factories produced planes in unprecedented numbers, and American factories churned out tanks, artillery, and ammunition. The sudden surge in production transformed the U.S. into a war machine, capable of projecting power across the Pacific Ocean. With all resources and attention directed toward Japan, Europe became a distant concern. Germany, having avoided war with the United States, continued its expansion in Europe with limited fear of American intervention. Britain and the Soviet Union faced the Axis largely on their own, forced to manage the European conflict without the full weight of U.S. military power. While sanctions and diplomatic pressure existed, they were not sufficient to deter Hitler or Mussolini. This separation of focus allowed the Pacific War to unfold as a singular struggle between the U.S. and Japan, reshaping the balance of power in Asia while leaving the European theater a tense but largely isolated battleground. Europe in limbo. With the United States fully engaged in the Pacific, Europe entered a state of tense uncertainty. Britain and the Soviet Union faced the Axis powers largely on their own, forced to shoulder the immense burden of defending against Germany's relentless advance. Supplies were limited, and without substantial American military aid, the Lend-Lease program offered only modest relief. Soviet counteroffensives were slowed, and strategic operations took longer to execute, allowing German forces to consolidate positions along the Eastern Front. Each advance reinforced the Reich's sense of invincibility, and the Germans exploited every tactical advantage, from mechanized divisions to elite panzer units, keeping the Allies constantly on the defensive. In North Africa, the contest between Rommel's Afrika Korps and British forces reached a tense stalemate. Supply lines stretched across deserts, making operations fragile and unpredictable. Britain's forces, exhausted by continuous engagements in multiple theaters, struggled to maintain momentum. Morale in London and Cairo fluctuated with every news report of German victories, and the shadow of a potential Axis breakthrough weighed heavily on political and military leaders. Without American air power and strategic bombing campaigns over Europe, German industrial centers remained largely untouched, allowing factories to produce tanks, aircraft, and munitions at full capacity. Germany's war machine grew stronger with each passing month. Cities in the Reich were safe from American bombers, while occupied territories supplied critical resources and manpower. Technological research advanced without disruption, producing more advanced aircraft, artillery, and armored vehicles. The Axis's confidence grew as Europe became a battleground where the Allies fought a defensive war without the full force of the United States. Britain clung to survival, The Soviet Union fought desperately on the Eastern Front, and the continent teetered on the edge of a protracted struggle, an uncertain limbo shaped by the absence of American intervention, leaving Germany poised to dominate Europe unchallenged from the West. Technology and arms race. The Manhattan Project continues, but urgency is slightly reduced without Germany as a direct threat. German V-1 and V-2 programs accelerate, unimpeded by Allied bombing. Jet fighters and advanced weaponry give Germany an edge in air defense, while the Allies struggle to keep pace. In this timeline, technology could reshape the European battlefield. The human cost. In this alternate timeline, the race for technological supremacy in Europe took on a new intensity. The Manhattan Project in the United States pressed forward, but with Germany avoiding direct conflict with America, the sense of immediate urgency was slightly reduced. American scientists still pursued nuclear research, aware of its future potential, but resources and strategic focus leaned heavily toward defeating Japan in the Pacific. Across the Atlantic, Germany accelerated its own weapons programs without the constant threat of Allied bombing raids. Factories producing V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets operated at full capacity, delivering innovations that shocked the world. German research pushed boundaries in rocketry, jet propulsion, and armored warfare, producing weapons that could outmatch Allied designs in both speed and firepower. The Luftwaffe benefited particularly from these advances. Jet fighters, like the Messerschmitt Me-262, dominated the skies in regions where air defense was critical, and experimental aircraft provided Germany with unprecedented reconnaissance and tactical capabilities. Anti-aircraft systems became more sophisticated, making it harder for Britain and the Soviet Union to challenge German air superiority. Even the Allies' efforts to develop long-range bombers and advanced fighter designs lagged, hampered by stretched resources and the absence of US-led European campaigns. German scientists collaborated closely with military engineers, rapidly converting breakthroughs into operational technology that could influence both defensive strategies and offensive campaigns. The European battlefield became a proving ground for modern warfare. Tanks evolved with better armor and firepower. Artillery became more precise, and communication systems improved command efficiency. Intelligence operations, both signals and human intelligence, advanced alongside these technologies, giving Germany a distinct edge in strategic planning. The absence of direct American intervention allowed Germany to experiment and implement innovations without major disruption, fundamentally altering the balance of power. In this scenario, technology no longer acted as a supplementary tool. It became the decisive factor, shaping Europe's conflict in ways that would redefine military strategy for decades to come. Stalemate and shifts. By 1944, the Pacific War had largely concluded with American dominance. Japan, crippled by relentless firebombing campaigns and the unprecedented force of nuclear strikes, was forced into surrender. The industrial might and technological capacity of the United States had proven decisive, bringing an end to the conflict in the East and showcasing the devastating potential of modern warfare. However, the focus on Japan meant that Europe remained a simmering cauldron of tension and conflict. Without direct American military intervention in the European theater, Germany continued to consolidate power across Eastern Europe, holding critical territories and maintaining control over North African supply lines and essential oil resources. This left Britain stretched to its limits, both economically and militarily, and forced the nation to consider the possibility of negotiating for a ceasefire to preserve its remaining influence. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union faced immense strain. Europe becomes a chessboard of shifting alliances, contested territories, and political maneuvering, with nations attempting to navigate survival in a world where traditional power structures have been upended. Economic instability, social upheaval, and ideological divisions create an environment of persistent uncertainty,